My parents said a woman shouldn't study and should just marry a rich man, but I ignored them and went to college. Now they're begging for my help. My mother called me selfish over a pan of burnt dinner rolls, which honestly tracks for my family. That was years after the biggest fights. Years after I had my own apartment and my own bills and a job title that made people straighten up a little when I said it out loud. But the sound of her voice still had this creepy ability to drag me straight back to being 15 and standing in a kitchen with a patched school skirt, while my younger brother showed off new expensive sneakers like he had personally discovered money. My name is Marisol, and if you met me now, you would probably think I'm one of those women who has it together. I manage operations for a mid-sized company, I pay my rent on time, I keep extra batteries and cold medicine in a drawer like a proper adult, and I own exactly 3 plants that are somehow still alive. I sound calm on conference calls. I make color-coded spreadsheets for fun when I'm angry. I look, from a distance, like a person who came from stable people. I did not. My father used to be a history teacher at a public high school in our mid-sized Pennsylvania town, which sounds like it should come with wisdom and fairness and maybe a love of facts. In our house, it mostly came with lectures. My mother ran a tiny clothing shop on a tired street where half the stores changed hands every year, and the other half survived by pretending they were doing better than they were. My brother was 4 years younger than me and raised like he was a fragile prince in a family that somehow only had enough softness for one child. I was the practical one, the independent one, which in my family was not a compliment. It was code for, we're not doing that for you, figure it out. There are so many little memories that by themselves sound stupid. Tiny things, petty things, the kind of details people tell you to let go because everybody's parents mess up. But when you stack them together, they form a whole building. At 15, I wore hand-me-down uniforms my mother adjusted with crooked stitching, while my brother got new shoes because boys apparently needed proper support for their growing feet. On birthdays, I got a cake from the grocery store with my name spelled right if the person behind the counter was having a good day. My brother got themed parties, matching plates, and my mother breathlessly asking if the balloons looked cheap. When my grandparents came over from my father's side, my grandmother would watch all this with her mouth pressed thin, like she knew exactly what was happening and hated it, but she almost never confronted my parents directly. She'd slip me $20 in the bathroom and tell me to buy myself something nice. My grandfather would ask about school too loudly, almost like he wanted to force my parents to acknowledge I existed. That was the most rebellion anyone managed. In high school, I got good grades because being useful was the only reliable way to get oxygen in that house. I stayed out of trouble, joined clubs that met after school, and learned very early that if I wanted praise, I had to earn it in private and then clap for myself later. My brother, meanwhile, got treated like his potential was some sacred national resource. My father paid for a test prep program for him when he was barely even interested in school yet, saying boys needed a strong push to launch right. My mother used to sigh at me and say things like, "You've always been so capable. Honey, you don't need all that hand-holding," which sounds nice until you realize it was always said right before they handed him something they would never even consider giving me. And look, I was not some saintly daughter floating above all this with graceful maturity. I rolled my eyes, I slammed cabinets. I said mean things under my breath. I was sarcastic in exactly the way adults hate from teenage girls because it forces them to hear themselves. I knew I was angry all the time, and I also knew anger made it easier for them to label me difficult. So I started doing that fun little thing girls do where they swallow half of what they want to say and then get called emotional anyway. By the time I was a senior, I was running on caffeine, resentment, and this very private fantasy that college would fix my life. Not in a movie way. I didn't think I'd go away and become some glowing new person under autumn leaves. I just thought maybe I could get out. Maybe I could get a degree, get a job with health insurance and a door that locked, and build a life where I wasn't always bracing for the next comment. I got accepted to a state university for business administration, and I remember printing the acceptance letter in the school library because I wanted to hold it in my hand before anybody at home had a chance to ruin it. I folded it into my backpack like it was a winning lottery ticket. That dinner after graduation is still one of those scenes I can replay down to the smell. Pot roast. Too much black pepper. My mother had lit the good candle because there was company coming the next day, and she liked pretending we were a family that used candles for dinner instead of power outages. I was excited in that raw, shaky way where your body is already preparing for impact, but your hope hasn't gotten the memo yet. I waited until plates were half empty, and then said I got in. Not just got in. Got into the program I wanted. I had looked into financial aid. I could work. I had a plan. My father put his fork down so hard it hit the plate with that sharp ceramic crack, And I knew before he even opened his mouth that whatever came next was not going to be congratulations. He stared at me like I had announced I was joining a circus. My mother smiled first, which somehow made it worse, because it was her soft, public smile, the one she used right before she said something cruel, in a voice sweet enough to make you question your own hearing. My father asked how exactly I expected to pay for 4 years of tuition. I said I had looked at aid packages, loans, maybe work study, maybe a job off campus if I had to. I had practiced this. I had pamphlets in my room. I was ready for concern. I was not ready for contempt. He said college debt was for fools and families with no pride. He said taking loans was basically begging with paperwork. Then he looked at my mother like he wanted an audience. And he said there was no point mortgaging our future so I could waste 4 years on a degree I would probably abandon the second I got married. Just like that. No build-up, no embarrassment, just a nice clean slice right through the middle of dinner. My mother reached across the table and touched my wrist with this fake tenderness that made me want to pull my skin off. She said very smart women scared off good men, and maybe I should think about what kind of life I really wanted. She said stability came from choosing wisely, not chasing every idea that crossed my mind. Then my father said the money they had managed to save would be reserved for my brother because a man needs a launch. A launch. Like I was a hobby and he was a mission. My brother sat there eating dessert while my future got discussed like an annoying expense. He didn't defend me. He didn't look uncomfortable. He just kept spooning whipped topping into his mouth and acting like this had nothing to do with him, which in some ways was worse than if he had smirked. If he had smirked, at least I could have hated him cleanly. Instead, he gave me that blank little boy expression he used whenever he didn't want responsibility near him. The one that said, "What do you want me to do about it?" I said I could take loans myself. My father snapped that nobody in his family was going to go around asking strangers to finance bad judgment. I said it wasn't asking strangers, it was literally how half the country paid for college. He raised his voice. My mother started crying on cue, saying I always had to make things dramatic, that I was trying to embarrass them, that I made every happy moment feel like an attack. That was her specialty, by the way. Take my pain, drape it over herself, and suddenly I was the villain for bleeding in her vicinity. I wish I could say I delivered some beautiful speech and walked away glowing with self-respect. I didn't. I cried. I said things that came out in gasps and fragments. I asked why it was always different for him. I asked what exactly they had ever sacrificed for me besides opportunities. My father told me if I didn't like the rules, I knew where the door was. So there it was. A family classic. Be grateful or leave. The next week, I applied for every scholarship I could find, took the first administrative assistant job that would hire me full-time, and enrolled anyway. Nobody helped me move. Nobody asked how I was going to do classes at night after working all day. My mother told 2 relatives I was being stubborn and wanted to prove some point. She said it the way people describe a child refusing to wear a coat. My father stopped bringing up school entirely, which in our house was how punishment worked. Silence instead of screaming. Dismissal instead of support. It made me feel like a ghost who still had chores. The first 4 years after that were ugly, if I'm being honest. Not inspiring. Not character building in the cute way people say when they mean, wow, glad that wasn't me. I worked from 8 to 5 in an office where the copier jammed every other day, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look like they were being medically drained. Then I drove straight to campus for classes that started in the evening and often ran until close to midnight. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Filing, front desk work, inventory help, anything that paid. I lived on cheap sandwiches, vending machine coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you cry because somebody drops a spoon. One night, I passed out in the library, just fully dropped. A girl from one of my classes shook me awake and kept asking if I was diabetic. I wasn't. I was broke and tired and trying to prove I deserved the space I was taking up in the world. I laughed when the campus nurse asked if I had a support system. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know how else to answer without sounding pathetic. Meanwhile, my brother did 2 years at a local community college with everything covered by my parents, decided it wasn't for him, quit, and got a sales job through one of my father's connections. It wasn't some glamorous thing, despite the way he later told it. He sold entry-level properties for a regional company and acted like he was closing skyscrapers in a power suit. At family gatherings, my mother would say he was so naturally gifted with people. About me, if anyone asked, she said I was busy. Just busy. As if I had become a weather pattern instead of a daughter. I kept going anyway. I graduated, then I got promoted, then again. Supervisor, coordinator, manager. Every step up felt good for about 10 minutes before the old ache came back, because achievements are weird when the people who should have celebrated you seem irritated you pulled them off without permission. By then, I was making more money than anyone else in my family, which sounds satisfying, and sometimes it was. But mostly it made them quiet around me in this brittle way that said they resented needing to update the story they told about me. I finally rented my own one-bedroom apartment a few years before I'd end up cutting my family off completely. It wasn't fancy. It had beige carpet that looked permanently worried, one bathroom with weird piping noises, and a narrow kitchen where opening the oven made it impossible to open the fridge. I loved it like people love things they bled for. Every fork in that drawer was mine, every stupid lamp. I had spent years sharing walls, sharing bathrooms, sharing air with people who treated me like I was temporary. So having a place where I could sit in silence and know nobody was about to barge in felt borderline spiritual. Not in a poetic way. More in a, wow, I can eat cereal in my underwear and nobody gets to comment kind of way. That winter I made the mistake of thinking maybe hosting a family holiday dinner could reset something. I know. People hear this part and ask why I keep giving them chances. The answer is embarrassing and simple. Because every now and then toxic families cough up one good afternoon and you start acting like maybe the last 20 years were a misunderstanding. Also, I wanted to prove something. To them, yes, but mostly to myself. I wanted to see everyone sitting in my living room eating food I paid for and feel like I had crossed some invisible line into adulthood they could not take from me. My brother arrived late with his girlfriend, who came from money in that effortless way that makes regular people feel sticky just standing near it. She was not rude right away. That would have been easier. She was cheerful. Complimentary, even. She said my apartment was so charming with this little pause before charming that carried a whole paragraph. She kept mentioning her parents' property without seeming to notice she was doing it, which is honestly a talent. Their guest house. Their summer place. The closet in her old room. My brother soaked it up like a man getting artificial sunlight. During dinner, he started making jokes. Small ones at first. About how compact the place was. About how his girlfriend's family probably had a walk-in closet bigger than my bedroom. Then he looked around my bathroom when he came back from washing his hands and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the whole thing could fit inside her mother's dressing room. He laughed like he had delivered a line on stage. His girlfriend did this tiny, uncomfortable laugh, which somehow made it more humiliating, because now I had to witness a stranger realizing my family was like this in real time. My mother giggled nervously and told me not to be sensitive. My father didn't say much, but there was a half smile there, the same one he used when he thought somebody else was teaching me a lesson he approved of. I kept serving food because if I had stopped moving, I might have thrown the mashed potatoes at his head. Then my brother asked if that was all there was. Nothing better? He said, glancing at the dishes like I had put out prison rations. He added that his girlfriend was used to a different standard. In my own apartment, eating a dinner I had cooked after working all week. Something in me just snapped clean in half, not dramatically, more like a wire burning out behind the wall. I put the serving spoon down and said, very calmly at first, that unlike him, I paid for the roof over my head myself. I said that if he wanted to compare lifestyles, maybe he should start with one he had actually earned. I pointed out that he was nearly 30, still living with our parents and walking around like proximity to his girlfriend's family wealth somehow counted as achievement. He went red so fast it almost impressed me. Then it got ugly. He called me jealous, a failure, bitter, said I had always hated seeing him happy, which would have been a stronger point if he had not been actively insulting me in my home while chewing food I made. My father banged his hand on the table and ordered me to apologize immediately, to my brother and to the girlfriend, because I was embarrassing the family. My mother started crying and saying I had ruined the holiday, that I always ruined everything with my temper, that I couldn't just let one little joke go. One little joke. Funny how the joke is always small when it's at my expense and huge when I answer back. I walked to the front door, opened it, and said everybody needed to leave. I said it cold because if I had let myself get emotional, they would have used it as proof I was unstable. My mother stared at me like I had slapped her. My father told me not to be ridiculous. My brother stood up and knocked his chair back and called me pathetic. I repeated myself. Out. Now. They went, but not quietly. My mother did the wounded martyr thing all the way down the hall. My father said I would regret this. My brother turned in the parking lot and yelled that I was going to die alone because nobody could stand being around me for long. I can still hear the shape of it, if not every exact word. You know how some sentences stick to your bones because they sound suspiciously like the thing you already fear about yourself? Yeah, that. After I locked the door, I sat on the kitchen floor in front of the dishwasher and cried so hard I gave myself a headache. Then, because humiliation and practicality are roommates, I got up and put the leftovers away. I blocked my brother that night. I didn't talk to him for 5 years. The silence with my parents after that was messy and fake. They would call occasionally, always pretending the main problem was my stubbornness. Never the favoritism. Never the insults. Never the way they had laughed along while he humiliated me. A few relatives started repeating that I had always been difficult, which was a line so obviously fed to them by my mother that I almost admired the consistency. I skipped holidays where my brother might be there. I made excuses. Work, headaches, deadlines, bad weather, whatever I needed. My grandparents still saw me. My grandmother would squeeze my hand and say I had done the right thing, though even she stopped short of telling my parents off directly. Family systems are amazing that way. Everybody sees it. Nobody wants the smoke. Over those 5 years, my life got steadier from the outside. Better apartment, better salary, health insurance that covered therapy, which was rude timing because by then I had enough issues to keep a therapist employed forever. I dated a little, nothing dramatic. Mostly men who liked that I seemed independent until they realized independence sometimes looks like difficulty letting anybody help you carry groceries. I worked too much. I slept with my phone under my pillow when quarterly reporting got bad. I told myself I was over my family. Then my grandmother called one spring afternoon and told me my brother was engaged to the same girlfriend from that dinner, and the whole old ache sat up inside me like it had been napping. Not dead. Apparently the wedding was going to be big. Bigger than big, actually. My brother had spent years orbiting that family and absorbing their standards like humidity, and now that he was getting married, he wanted every possible surface polished to prove he belonged in their world. Fancy venue, see? Imported flowers. A menu nobody in our family would have known how to pronounce without rehearsal. My parents, who should have had the sense to sit down and count their actual dollars before opening their mouths, promised publicly that they would cover the venue and the decor. Publicly. In front of people who absolutely did not need to know their finances, but definitely needed to know their pride. That part came to me in pieces through my grandparents and one aunt who still occasionally spoke to me without making it weird. My parents were obsessed with not looking small next to the future in-laws. My mother was apparently talking about centerpieces like she was producing a state wedding. My father was acting like this was an investment in family respectability. Family respectability. We could not even survive one honest dinner, but sure, let's perform class status for strangers. Then reality did what reality always does when you build a fantasy on top of a checking account. They finally sat down with actual estimates and realized the event was going to cost almost 3 times what they had available, and the wedding was only a few months away. I heard all that before they showed up at my apartment, which made the whole visit feel like a thunderstorm you smell before you see. They came without calling. That alone was enough to put me in a bad mood. My mother had one of those tight little smiles that meant she needed something and had already decided I was selfish for not offering it fast enough. My father looked annoyed to be there, which was incredible considering he was the one arriving at my home empty-handed to ask for money. I let them in because curiosity is a character flaw of mine. They sat in the same living room my brother had mocked years earlier, and for one vicious second I wondered if either of them noticed that nothing in here looked cheap. Not because I was rich, because I had spent years learning how to buy carefully and stretch a dollar without making my life look sad. My father cleared his throat and explained they needed a substantial loan. He said loan like he was discussing a respectable business arrangement between equals, not asking the daughter he had once practically called shameless for considering student debt. My mother started crying before he got halfway through the explanation. She talked about humiliation, about appearances, about how devastating it would be if the groom's side could not uphold what had been promised. She said I didn't understand how important this was for the family, which is wild because the family had spent most of my life making it very clear I was not central enough to matter when it counted. I let them finish. I really did. Then I asked if loans were still pathetic and shameful, or if that moral principle had expired when the bill involved imported flowers. The look on my father's face was almost worth the whole miserable childhood. He said this was different. Of course it was. It was about family honor. Not a wasteful degree. Not personal ambition. Not pride. Family honor. I asked whether one day of fancy table settings was genuinely more important than the education that let me build the life they were currently trying to borrow from. My mother cried harder and said, "After everything we've done for you." I asked her, very calmly, to name one thing. Just one. The room went so quiet I could hear my refrigerator humming. She stared at me like I had violated some sacred code by asking for evidence. My father told me I was being cruel for the sake of it. I told him no, I was being specific, which our family often confused with cruelty, because facts had a bad habit of ruining their preferred storyline. Then I said no. Not maybe. Not let me think about it. No. He stood up so fast I thought for a second he might actually knock something over. He said I was petty, vindictive, and eager to punish everyone forever over old misunderstandings. Old misunderstandings. That phrase made me laugh in his face. Laugh. My mother did the martyr glance around the room like the walls themselves might witness her suffering and report it later. They left angry. Not ashamed. Not thoughtful. Angry. 2 days later, my phone started blowing up. Aunt, cousin, other cousin. An uncle I hadn't seen in ages suddenly remembered I existed long enough to text me that money had gone to my head. A relative I barely knew left a voicemail saying my parents had sacrificed so much and I was cold-hearted for abandoning them in their hour of need. My mother had clearly gone on tour with a revised version of events where I was the rich, ungrateful daughter refusing to help the loving parents who had done everything for me. Nobody mentioned that I had paid my own way through college. Nobody mentioned the years of sexist garbage. Nobody mentioned that the wedding they couldn't afford was for the son they had always prioritized. I blocked numbers until my thumb hurt. But before I blocked them, I read enough to do that awful thing where the gaslighting starts working because it comes in chorus form. A small part of me wondered if I was being too hard. Whether I should just wire the money and buy myself peace. Whether maybe this was one of those moments mature adults swallow their pride and do the decent thing. Then I remembered falling asleep over textbooks with a sandwich in my lap, while my brother lived at home with his expenses covered. And the guilt dried right up. I cut contact with my parents after that. Full stop. No calls, no texts, no holiday cards with fake signatures. Nothing. I was done being the emergency backup fund for people who had treated my future like an inconvenience. Silence would have been nice. Silence did not happen. About a week later, there was pounding at my apartment door hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it and found my father standing there already halfway into a rage, my mother right behind him with her purse clutched to her chest like she was about to testify in church. Before I could say anything, he pushed past me into the apartment without being invited. That old move. The one from childhood where my space was never really mine if he had decided otherwise. I told him he needed to leave. He ignored me. He launched straight into this speech about how I had destroyed the relationship between my parents and their son. Their son. Not my brother, not our family. Their son. He said when they told him they couldn't cover everything they had promised, he panicked, felt humiliated, and turned on them. Apparently, he had yelled that they made him look ridiculous in front of his future in-law. Apparently, my mother cried. My father shouted back. And the whole thing exploded in the dramatic trash fire you would expect when a lifetime of enabling finally stops paying off. Then came the part that was somehow supposed to land on me. My father said if I had just helped, none of that would have happened, that I had caused this out of spite, that my refusal had poisoned the family and left them exposed. My mother started sobbing and said they had lost the only son who still cared, which was a nasty little sentence even by our standards. Then she corrected herself in the most insulting way possible by saying she didn't mean it like that. Sure. I told them what I honestly believed, that they had created this exact disaster by building my brother into a man who thought promises were facts and consequences were other people's problem. I said he reacted the way he did because nobody had ever taught him disappointment without rescue. I said this was not my bill, emotionally or financially. My father's face changed when I said that. It got colder, less furious. More dangerous in that ordinary domestic way where you know the yelling phase is over and the cruelty phase has started. He said I had always enjoyed acting superior, that I thought paying my own way made me better than the family that raised me. I said no, I thought paying my own way meant I didn't owe them a performance of gratitude every time they needed something. My mother told me I was heartless. I told her being done wasn't the same as being heartless. She cried harder. Of course she did. Tears were her smoke machine. They came out whenever she needed to blur the stage. The argument lasted maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. Hard to say. Time gets weird when your nervous system is trying to decide whether to scream or freeze. At one point, my father jabbed a finger toward me and said I would pay for tearing the family apart. He did not mean physically, before anybody gets dramatic. He meant socially, emotionally, through reputation, through the old family network of whispers and rewrites and moral theater. Still, hearing your own father say you'll pay for telling the truth does something gross to your insides. After they left, I locked the door, slid down against it, and started shaking so hard I could barely text my grandmother. She called me immediately and told me if they showed up again, I should not open the door. She also said, very flatly, that my father had always confused obedience with love. It was one of the only blunt things she ever said about him, and I held on to it like a receipt. 3 weeks passed. I started sleeping again. Work got busy enough to distract me. I told myself maybe the worst of it was over. Then my brother showed up. I opened the door and almost shut it again on instinct. He looked different. Not transformed. Not humbled by divine intervention. Just tired. His posture was off. His face looked puffy around the eyes, like either he had been sleeping badly or fighting a lot, maybe both. He asked if he could come in. I said no. He asked if we could at least talk in the hallway. So we did, which probably made my neighbors think I was dealing with a very awkward door-to-door salesman. He started with an apology. Not a perfect one. An organized one. He said he had handled things badly at the holiday dinner years ago. He admitted he had been arrogant and immature. He said our parents had set both of us up in different ways and that he was trying to understand that now. Some of it sounded rehearsed. Some of it sounded almost real. I stood there in socks on my own doormat trying to decide whether I was witnessing growth or strategy. Then, right on schedule, he got to the actual reason he was there. He needed help. A loan. Temporary. He had ideas, of course. A repayment plan. Interest even, as if adding a tiny business school flourish would make the whole thing less insulting. He said he wanted to fix things between us, but he also didn't want one financial crisis to ruin his future. His future. That phrase again. Everybody in my family always talked like my life was the background music for somebody else's big scene. I said I needed time to think. I didn't mean it. I just wanted to see what would happen if he did not get an immediate answer. And wow, did I get my answer? His face hardened almost instantly. The careful tone dropped. He said he was trying here. That he was being the bigger person by coming to me after everything. Bigger person. By asking the sister he had mocked and dismissed to bankroll the wedding he couldn't afford. I asked if he heard himself. He said I loved holding old grudges because they made me feel righteous. I said I loved not being used, actually. Easier hobby. That's when he started yelling. He said I had always been jealous of him. Since childhood. Since forever. That I couldn't stand seeing him happy, loved, successful. Successful was an especially funny word given the circumstances, but I was too angry to laugh. He was standing in my hallway, half turned toward the stairs, gesturing with both hands like a man pitching a startup nobody asked for, and he really expected me to believe I was the unstable one in that scenario. I told him the truth the way ugly truths usually come out, which is fast and without much elegance. I said he was exactly like our parents in all the worst ways, entitled, manipulative, allergic to responsibility unless it came wrapped in praise. I said he hadn't shown up because he felt bad. He had shown up because he needed money and thought an apology would function as a coupon. He flinched at that, which told me it landed. Instead of backing off, he stepped closer. Not lunging. Not anything cinematic. Just that ordinary aggressive move people do when they want to make you feel crowded in your own space. I told him to get out. He said we were having an adult conversation and I was behaving like a spoiled child. Spoiled. Me. I actually laughed then, and that made him even madder. When I moved to shut the door, he put his hand on the edge of it. Again, not movie stuff. No smashed frames or wrestling in the hallway. Just enough pressure to say, you don't get to end this yet. My body reacted before my brain did. Every nerve I owned lit up. I shoved his shoulder once and yelled for him to leave. He kept talking over me. So I did the one thing I knew would embarrass him more than anything else. I raised my voice and shouted down the hall for the building manager and said I would call the police if he didn't get away from my door. That changed things. It was like somebody let the air out of him. He took his hand off the door immediately, partly because he was startled, partly because the thought of neighbors hearing the word police was apparently more horrifying than his own behavior. He backed up and called me toxic, said he would tell everybody what I was really like. I said, please do, which was not my wisest line, but definitely one of my favorites. Then I shut the door, locked it, and stood there shaking so hard I had to lean on the wall. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt furious, sick, weirdly sad, and embarrassed all at once. Family fights are gross like that. Even when you know you're right, there's still this little voice whispering, look at you, screaming in a hallway like this is your life now. I cried in the shower. Then I got mad at myself for crying. Then I ordered takeout. I couldn't really justify financially because I was too drained to cook. Real glamour. For a couple of weeks after that, I jumped every time someone knocked on my door. I checked the peephole like I lived in a spy movie, which I absolutely did not. I told my manager I needed a day off because of a family situation. And she gave me the kind of look women give each other when we all know that phrase means disaster without needing subtitles. I spent one Saturday deep cleaning my apartment with aggressive music on just to burn off adrenaline. I threw out expired spices. I reorganized the junk drawer. I found a receipt from 3 years earlier and cried over that too, because apparently my nervous system had decided absolutely anything could be a trigger if it tried hard enough. Then, 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail with my name written in my mother's familiar looping handwriting. It was a wedding invitation. I actually thought it might be a joke at first. Or bait. Or one of those manipulative gestures where somebody invites you only so they can later say, "See, we included you," and then blame you for not showing. I left it on my counter for 3 days before opening it properly. Cream paper, formal wording, my brother's name, the date. A venue I had heard of but would never book even if I suddenly won the lottery and lost all sense. My grandparents called that evening and mentioned they had gotten invitations too. My grandmother said the whole thing felt strange. My grandfather, who never wasted words, said, "Something shifted." That sentence sat with me. Because he was right. Something had shifted. I just didn't know in whose favor. I stared at the invitation for another day, then finally called my brother. He answered on the third ring, sounding cautious, like he expected me to scream. I didn't. I asked if the invitation was real. He said yes. I asked why. Long pause. Like, long enough that I pulled the phone away to check if the call had dropped. Finally, he said he had meant some of the apology. Not all of it in the clean, noble way I might have wanted, but enough that he had wanted to fix things before the wedding. Then he panicked about money and ruined whatever sincerity had existed. He said after our fight, he ended up telling his fiancée more of the truth than he ever had before. Not because he woke up enlightened. Exactly. More because he had run out of ways to explain the chaos without exposing where it came from. He told her about the favoritism, about my college, about the holiday dinner, about our parents, about all of it. I stood there in my kitchen barefoot, gripping the edge of the counter, while he quietly admitted that she had been disgusted. Not by me, by him. Once he started talking, it all came out in this awkward, halting stream that sounded way less like redemption and way more like somebody finally cornered by his own lies. He said his fiancée had already noticed things not adding up. Different stories from different relatives. My mother making herself sound heroic in ways that apparently raised even her eyebrows. One aunt, after 2 glasses of wine at some pre-wedding event, had filled in several missing pieces with the bluntness only extended family can deliver. Not because she was brave, probably. More because she likes drama and happened to be holding it at the right angle. According to him, his fiancée was furious that he had hidden the real family dynamic from her. Furious that he had let her believe I was just cold and difficult when the truth was uglier and much more ordinary. She confronted him about the way he had benefited from everything without ever naming it. About the way he had repeated our parents' treatment of me because it kept his life easier. She apparently said, and I cherish this line, that adulthood was a terrible time to discover the man you planned to marry still needed a moral babysitter. I asked what that had to do with the invitation. He said she had agreed to cover the remaining wedding costs through her family, but with conditions. He had to stop lying. He had to make amends where he could. He had to tell the truth about what had happened, not spin it, not soften it into misunderstandings. Say it plain. Which, honestly, sounded less like romance and more like a probation plan. But maybe that's what he needed. Then he told me something I truly did not expect. My parents had never actually been banned from the wedding. During the huge fight about money, they were the ones who had declared they were clearly not wanted and stormed out in full tragic parent mode. He had tried later to tell them they were still invited. Multiple times, apparently. But by then, they had committed to the narrative where they had been rejected by their ungrateful son after sacrificing everything. It fit too nicely with their self-image to give up. So instead, they told people they had been pushed out and let the sympathy roll in. The whole thing made me sick in that tired way where you're not shocked, just exhausted by how predictable it all is once someone finally says it out loud. I asked if he expected me to forgive him because his fiancée made him do homework. He said no. At least not immediately. He said he just wanted me to know I had not imagined any of it. Which sounds like a small thing, but if you grow up in a house where reality gets rewritten every time your feelings inconvenience someone, hearing the other person admit the truth matters in a gross, painful way. I did not melt. I did not say, "Oh my God, family is family, let's heal." Absolutely not. I told him I was glad he had finally noticed the house was on fire, but I had been coughing on smoke for years. He went quiet. Then he said he knew. That was maybe the most honest part of the whole conversation. because he did not dress it up. He just knew. We ended the call without a grand moment. No tears. No promise to start over. Just a weird, uncomfortable truce where two damaged adults recognized they had survived the same parents from different positions in the blast radius. I spent the next few days arguing with myself about whether to go. One minute, I thought absolutely not. Why would I volunteer for a room full of old humiliation and expensive chairs? The next minute, I thought maybe showing up on my own terms would matter to me more than to him. My therapist, who by then knew my family tree like a cursed map, asked what choice would let me sleep best afterward. I hated that question because it was good. Then my brother called again. He sounded almost embarrassed, asking, which I appreciated. He said if I did come, would I be willing to stand with him for part of the ceremony prep? Because our parents were still refusing contact and the whole thing felt ugly. He did not frame it as me saving him. More like, I don't know how to do this and I'm asking. There is a difference. Tiny, but real. I said I would think about that too. In the end, I went. Not because I forgave him. Not because I believed one round of honesty erased a lifetime of cowardice. I went because my grandparents were old and tired and didn't deserve another family scene. I went because some part of me wanted to see with my own eyes what this mess had become. And, if I'm being brutally honest, I went because I wanted proof that my parents' absence would not collapse the sky the way they always acted like it would. The day of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror in a dress I had nearly returned twice and thought, this is ridiculous. I'm getting dressed to attend the expensive emotional aftermath of my own childhood, but I did my makeup anyway, lightly, nothing dramatic. I was not trying to arrive looking like revenge. I just wanted to look like a woman who belonged in any room she chose to walk into. The venue was beautiful in that polished, neutral, aggressively tasteful way money tends to produce. Fresh flowers, soft lighting, staff moving around like they had rehearsed breathing. My grandparents were already there. My grandmother clutching tissues and trying to pretend it was allergies. A couple of distant aunts showed up. That was basically it from our side. Fewer than 10 people, and half of them looked like they had dressed for joy but packed disappointment in their handbags. My brother's fiancée found me before the ceremony and apologized. Not dramatically, not trying to make us friends. She just said she had judged the situation badly and should have asked more questions sooner. I appreciated that. I also noticed she looked at me with a kind of careful respect after that, which was new and strangely sad because I had never wanted to earn dignity through surviving my family in public. The whole thing felt beautiful and bleak at the same time. You know when something is objectively nice? The flowers are right, the music is soft, the food smells expensive, and yet the air still feels wrong because everybody knows who is missing and why. That. Every smile had a little strain in it. Every photo setup had this invisible blank space where my parents should have been if they had been capable of choosing reality over pride. Before the ceremony started, my brother and I stood off to the side near a closed door while guests settled in. He looked nervous enough to be human for once. Not charming nervous. Not polished. Just a man sweating through his shirt collar because life had finally stopped cushioning him. He thanked me for coming. I said, "Don't make me regret it," which was the closest I had to warmth at the time. He almost laughed. Then he said he was sorry again, quieter than before. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do with it. Walking into that ceremony, as his sister, felt surreal. For years I had built my peace around not being anywhere near him. Now there I was, in heels that hurt, and with my grandmother's compact in my purse, participating in the formal beginning of his marriage, because our parents had chosen martyrdom over attendance. If you had described that to me 5 years earlier, I would have told you to get out of my apartment. Life loves irony when it thinks you need humbling. The ceremony itself was short, thoughtful. The officiant talked about honesty, partnership, and doing the work of choosing each other daily, which almost made me laugh at the timing, but also felt pointed enough that I wondered whether the couple had picked those lines on purpose. My brother's voice shook during his vows. His fiancée's didn't. She sounded grounded in a way I envied. Not soft. Steady. Like somebody who knew love without truth was just theater. At the reception, people did what people always do around family fractures. They pretended not to stare while very obviously tracking the tension. A few of the bride's relatives were kind to me in that extra careful way people get when they know there has been drama and are trying not to step on it. My grandparents stayed until dessert and then left early because my grandfather's back was bothering him. I walked them to their car and my grandmother squeezed my face with both hands and said, "I'm proud of you for staying yourself," which was such a grandmother sentence, and yet it almost undid me. Inside, the room glowed. Music, speeches, clinking glasses, candles. My brother's mother-in-law, now technically something to me, though I try not to over-label people, moved through the room with the serene efficiency of someone used to hosting events that don't involve emotional landmines. I watched my brother thank her and saw genuine humility in him for maybe the first time in my life. Not full transformation. I am not that naive, but a crack, maybe. Enough for some light to get in. Ugh, sorry, that sounded poetic. You know what I mean. He looked less certain that the universe owed him applause. I stayed long enough to be respectable and left before things got too sentimental. In the parking lot, sitting alone in my car with my shoes off and my feet throbbing, I finally let myself feel the weirdness of it. Not closure. Definitely not healing in some neat made-for-television bow. More like confirmation. Proof that the family story my parents had always pushed was not the only available version. They had made themselves absent, they had made themselves tragic, and the world stubbornly kept spinning without casting them in the lead role. More than a year passed after that. My brother became a father. He and his wife named their son after our paternal grandfather instead of our father, which said a lot without needing a speech. My parents never reached out. Not to congratulate him, not to ask about the baby, not to me either. No dramatic apology, no midnight reckoning, just silence, which in some ways was the purest form of them. If they could not be admired, they preferred to be mourned, and if they could not be mourned properly, they vanished. My grandparents became active great-grandparents with the kind of joy that made me happy and furious at the same time. Happy because they adored that baby. Furious because watching them coo over him in ordinary, gentle ways made it even clearer how little tenderness had existed in my own house growing up. I visited often enough that my nephew started reaching for me before he could say my name properly. The first time he toddled toward me with both hands out, I had to blink fast and look at the wall for a second. I am not great at receiving uncomplicated affection. Working on it. My relationship with my brother settled into something careful, cordial, functional, better than before, nowhere near innocent. We talked about practical things, diaper blowouts, sleep schedules, which side of town had the better pediatric clinic. We did not sit around unpacking childhood every weekend. There are some wounds that get cleaner with distance, not repeated handling. Every now and then he would say something that showed he really had started rethinking the past. And I would feel this confusing mix of satisfaction and grief. Satisfaction because finally, obviously. Grief because recognition after the damage is done is still late. I also noticed things I hated noticing. How easy warmth came from his wife's family. The way they included him in little rituals without making him audition for belonging. Sunday dinners. Group texts about birthdays. Extra folding chairs appearing without anybody turning it into a sacrifice. It irritated me in that petty, ugly way because part of me wanted to say, where was all this when I was begging life to be less sharp? But another part of me understood that envy was not about wanting their exact family. It was about finally seeing a version of ordinary care and realizing how radical it had always been. Sometimes people ask if I miss my parents. I miss the idea of having parents. I miss the version of them I kept trying to manufacture out of scraps. I miss what their love might have looked like if it had not always come with conditions, roles, and rankings. But them, specifically? The actual two people who kept choosing pride over honesty? No. What hurts is not losing them. What hurts is understanding, over and over, that a lot of what I thought was love was performance with decent timing. The older my nephew got, the stranger my own history started to feel in my body. Babies do that, I think. They expose things. You hold this tiny person who drools on your shirt and kicks one sock off with the determination of a tiny drunk man, and suddenly your whole nervous system starts asking questions you were not planning to answer before lunch. Like, how hard would it really have been for someone to choose softness with me more often? Like, why did basic care always feel like a prize to be earned in my house instead of a starting point? Like, why was I 40 different kinds of prepared for disappointment by the time I was 12? I never became especially close to my brother again, and I want to be clear about that because people love a redemption arc way more than reality usually supports. We were not suddenly best friends. We did not call each other every night. We did not tearfully rebuild from the ground up while inspirational music played somewhere off-screen. He was still him. I was still me. We had a history full of splinters. But we did reach this awkward adult understanding where we could exist in the same room without pretending the past had been fine. And honestly, that was more than I once thought possible. There were setbacks. Of course there were. One time, about 6 months after the baby was born, he casually joked that I was still kind of scary when I'm mad, and I looked at him so hard he went pale. Because there it was, The old family reflex. Reduce my anger to a personality flaw instead of asking what caused it. He apologized quickly, said he had not meant it that way. Maybe he hadn't. But intent is such a convenient little pillow people like to hide behind after they've thrown something sharp at you. I told him if he wanted this fragile version of a sibling relationship to continue, he needed to stop reaching for old scripts when he got uncomfortable. He said, okay. Then, to his credit, he actually listened. My own life kept moving in the non-cinematic way lives do. Work stayed busy. I got one promotion and turned down another because I finally learned that more money is not always worth becoming a haunted shell with excellent email response times. I started dating a man from another department for a while, then ended it when I realized he was attracted to the idea of me being low maintenance, which is a phrase men should really stop using unless they want women to hear, I'm looking for someone who won't have needs. I took a weekend trip alone. I bought better pillows. I unfollowed a bunch of relatives from a social media app because even seeing their vacation photos annoyed me on principle. Healing is glamorous stuff. Every now and then one of my parents' flying monkeys would resurface. A text from a cousin saying my mother still cried over the family breakdown. A message from an aunt hinting that life was short and maybe I should reconsider reconciliation. Nobody ever came to me with specifics, interestingly. Nobody said, your father admitted he was wrong. Your mother wants to talk honestly. It was always vague, emotional pressure without accountability attached. The family version of recycling old air. I ignored it. Then my grandfather got sick for a while. Not catastrophic, thankfully, but enough to scare all of us. Hospital stay, medication changes, long afternoons in waiting rooms that smell like sanitizer and stale coffee. During that time, the topic of my parents came up more than once because stress has a way of dragging every unresolved thing to the surface. My grandmother, who had protected them with silence for most of my life, finally admitted she regretted not interfering more when I was younger. She said she kept telling herself it wasn't her place to challenge how they raised their children. Then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said sometimes not interfering is just cowardice dressed up as respect. That wrecked me more than any dramatic apology could have, because it was true. And because hearing an older woman say it so plainly felt like somebody finally naming a law I had been living under without consent. It also made me rethink my own role in my nephew's life. I could not be the fun aunt who noticed things and stayed quiet because speaking up felt awkward. If I was going to stay in his world, I wanted to show up honestly, not harshly, not hovering, just honestly. So when my brother and his wife started drifting into some uneven patterns after the baby, mostly around emotional labor and whose career mattered more on hard weeks, I did not pretend not to see. I did not stage an intervention either. Again, real life. But when my brother complained to me once that his wife was always tense now, I told him maybe she was exhausted from carrying the invisible half of parenting, while also trying not to become the household manager of a grown man. He got defensive. Then he got quiet. Then, a few days later, he texted me and said he had been a jerk and had booked the pediatric appointment himself. Tiny step. Still counts. That is the thing about family damage. It reproduces if nobody interrupts it. Not always in giant, obvious ways, sometimes in small, lazy assumptions. In who gets thanked, in who gets heard, in whose dreams are treated like the default setting and whose are treated like optional accessories. I had lived my whole life inside those patterns. Seeing them start to repeat one generation down made my skin crawl. My parents, meanwhile, stayed ghosts by choice. I found out through a relative that they had started telling people they were giving the children space because they refused to be disrespected further. Which, wow. Even their absence had to come with self-praise. Apparently, they had also complained that my brother's wife's family turned him against them, as if he had no agency and no memory of his own. They blamed me too, naturally. I was still the difficult daughter, the cold one, the one who had always thought she was better. Funny how they never promoted me to saint no matter how much responsibility I carried. But let me say no once, and suddenly I had the power to destroy dynasties. Sometimes I wonder if they really believe their own version, or if belief stopped mattering years ago and what they actually need is the performance. Maybe those are the same thing after long enough. Maybe if you repeat a lie inside a family for enough holidays, it starts furnishing the place. I used to fantasize about some final confrontation where I would say every perfect thing and they would have to hear it. I don't anymore. Not because I became wiser than rage. I still have rage. Plenty. But because I finally understood something annoying and freeing. People who protect their delusions that hard are not waiting for your evidence. They are waiting for your participation. They need you inside the play. They need your tears, your defenses, your willingness to argue on their stage so they can keep casting themselves as misunderstood. Leaving the theater is less satisfying than a speech, but it does save time. A little after that, I bought a place of my own, not a mansion, not some revenge house with a 2-story foyer and a staircase for dramatic entrances. A small condo with creaky floors, morning light, and a kitchen big enough that I could cook without bruising my hip on every single appliance. The day I got the keys, I stood in the empty living room eating drive-through fries out of the bag and thinking, wow, nobody gets to insult this one at my dinner table. That was my first thought. Not gratitude, not maturity, spite with a mortgage. I invited my brother's family over for the first holiday dinner there because apparently I enjoy emotional challenges disguised as menus. My nephew ran in like he paid the property taxes himself. My brother offered to help in the kitchen without turning it into a heroic event, which I noticed. His wife brought pie and did not let me do that fake hostess thing, where I insist I need no help while quietly drowning. A couple of my close friends came too, because by then, I had finally learned that the people who make a table feel safe are not always the ones who share your blood. Sometimes they are just the ones who show up on time, bring extra ice, and don't rewrite your life when you leave the room. Dinner was loud and imperfect and ordinary. Somebody spilled cider. My nephew dropped a roll and blamed gravity like he was presenting legal defense. He asked 3 personal questions in under 10 minutes about why I didn't have a dog, whether my job was boring, and if adults ever got to eat dessert first, then wandered off to investigate my bookshelves. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. At one point, I looked around the room and felt this strange pressure behind my ribs. Not sadness, not happiness either. Something fuller and harder to name. Because nobody there was performing family. Nobody was keeping score. Nobody needed me to be the easy one so they could stay comfortable. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't bracing. I was just in my home, with people who knew the ugly version too, and still passed me the potatoes like that was enough information. A week later, I was putting away some recipe cards from my grandmother's box when I found one I had somehow missed. It wasn't a recipe, just her handwriting on a blank index card. It said, "Make your own table and bless it." I sat down on my kitchen floor and cried so hard I scared myself a little. Because that was what I had done, even before I had words for it. So no, the scar never disappeared. There are still days when a certain tone of voice can drag me straight back to that old house. There are still moments when I hear somebody praise a son for the bare minimum, and my whole body tenses before my brain catches up. There are still holidays when I think about what it might have been like to grow up in a family where love didn't need a favorite child to orbit around. But that grief doesn't run the place anymore. My parents are still out there somewhere, probably explaining themselves badly to anyone willing to listen. My brother is still trying. My nephew is loud in the healthiest way and still thinks dinosaur pajamas count as formal wear. I still get angry. I still overwork when I'm stressed and clean my kitchen like I'm trying to scrub a memory off the counters. But I also have a home, boundaries, people who show up honestly, and enough self-respect now to know that being unloved correctly by the wrong people doesn't make me hard to love. It just made me harder to fool. And honestly, after everything, I can live with that.